In this tutorial, we're going to understand the inner details of an interceptor. We're going to take an interceptor, pull it apart, open it up, see what are the inner workings of the interceptor, and in the process, we'll try to understand how all the interceptors work. We know how to configure the interceptors. We've seen that in the previous tutorial, but we still don't know what actually makes an interceptor. What is the actual code in the Java class? So I'll give you an example scenario, and I want you to think about how you would implement such a functionality, how you would implement such an interceptor. So just to get your thought process going, what I'll do is I'll give you a scenario where let's say I have this Struts application, and I have one action class. That should do for now. Okay, so this is an action class, and I have 3 different interceptors. Actually, why don't I add a couple of more action classes? I think that'll come in handy. So assume that we have like 3 action classes. Okay, so we have this is action 1, this is action 2, and this is action 3. And this is interceptor 1, interceptor 2, and interceptor 3. So what do we know about interceptors? So when we make a request, depending on which action it goes to, there are some interceptors that are run. So let's say for action A1, I have the interceptors I1, I2, and I3 configured in this order. So what's actually happening now? When a request comes, which A1 has to address, the pre-processing step of interceptor I1 runs, right? So there is a pre-processing step, and then the pre-processing step of interceptor I2 runs, and then the pre-processing of interceptor I3 runs. There's no specific thing as pre-processing. There is some logic which runs. That's my whole point. Okay, so there is logic in I1 that runs, there's logic in I2 that runs, and there's logic in I3 that runs. Okay, and then we see the call going to A1, and now A1 does its job, it finishes execution, and then it returns. Now what actually happens is there is a different piece of logic that runs in I3, there's a different piece of logic that runs in I2, there's a different piece of logic that runs in I1. Okay, so the whole idea of having some piece of logic run in the beginning before the action and then some piece of logic run at the end is kind of common to interceptors. You might have some preparation logic over here and you might have some cleanup logic over here. One example that I can give you is the timer interceptor. So there is an interceptor called the timer interceptor. The only purpose of the timer interceptor is to calculate the amount of time it takes for the rest of the process. So let's say this I1 is the timer interceptor. So what happens is in the pre-processing part of the logic, right, when the part of the code that gets executed before it hands out to the action class. So this kind of makes a note of the time when this is run, right? And when all the other interceptors run and then the action runs and then on the way back, this makes a note of the time. So basically, you get to know the difference in time from the start of the execution to the end of the execution. So if you configure I1 at the beginning of the chain, you get to know the time difference from the start to including all the interceptor times and the time required for the action to execute, and then the rest of the interceptors, and it comes back. So if you configure I1 at the end, right, if the timer interceptor is at the very end, you get the time taken by the action alone and not by the interceptors. So it's a handy thing to know. You can measure how much time your action or your action plus interceptors take. So timer interceptor is one of the interceptors. So the way it works is, like I said, so there is a pre-processing set of code which actually makes a note of the time and then passes on the control. And then when the control comes back, irrespective of what happened before it, so there's a post-processing step which makes a note of the time and then gives you a, you can find out the difference in the time. So it's common to have interceptors which have a pre set of lines of code and then a post set of lines of code. All these interceptors have such a functionality. So this is what's going to happen when you have interceptors configured in this order. So I1, I2, I3. So A1 has the interceptors I1, I2, I3 configured. So this is the flow. This is how the flow of control goes. Now let us say A2 has I3 and I2 configured, okay, in this order. So when a call comes in and A2 has to handle it, then what happens is I3 runs first. So this piece of code runs first, okay, and then this hands control to this interceptor. So this runs second, right, and then this piece of code hands control to the action. So A2 runs after that, and then after A2 is run, this runs. So this would be 3, and after that on the return, so I2 post processing has to run. So this would be 4, and then I3's post processing has to run, which is 5. Okay, so this is the flow for A2. Okay, so I hope you understand that this is very, very flexible, right? Irrespective of what logic is there inside each of these interceptors, the flow of control is entirely dependent on the way you've configured it in the Struts XML. And the same interceptors and the same classes hand over control to different other interceptors or action classes depending on their order in the XML. So this piece of code, right, the piece of code in I1, the pre-processing piece of code in I1, has no idea which interceptor is going to come next, and it shouldn't, because it could be I2, it could be I3, it could be I10 later. All it does is it does its piece of work, and then it hands it over to the next interceptor which comes, or if it's the last interceptor, hands it over to the action. So now I want you to take a minute and think about how this could be implemented. Let's say you're writing this logic. How would you do it? We know that every interceptor is a Java class. So I1 is a simple Java class. I2 is a Java class. So there has to be a method here, right? So there could be a method over here. Say I1 inside the I1 class. Let's say there is a method. Let's call it pre for now. Okay, assuming that we have two separate methods. Let's go with this for now. This is not actually the way it's done, but let's think through how this could be. Okay, let's say we want to implement it exactly like what we see over here. Every interceptor class has a pre and a post. So the logic inside the methods are pretty straightforward. Let's say for this one, right, you're just making a note of the time. So it's pretty straightforward. Now the tricky part is, how do you find out who to hand control to, right? What is the next method to call? So the only way an interceptor can actually know is by taking a look at the Struts XML, okay? Because that's where it's configured. So for A1 it's this, for A2 it's this, for a different action it's something else. You have to take a look at it, right? There's no other way out, because an interceptor, when it runs, it needs to know for which action it's running. It needs to know its place. Where am I in the chain, and based on that, it's going to look up the next interceptor and hand it over to that guy, or if it's the last guy in the chain, it's going to hand it over to the action. And the same thing for the post, right? So it needs to know where it's going to go next. So this is actually the part of the code where you need to hand control over. There has to be some piece of the code in pre and the post. This has to be there for every interceptor, right? So this is actually duplicate code. So it's not a good idea for the interceptor itself to look at the Struts XML, because it has to be there in every interceptor, and it's not really the interceptor's concern. We are kind of having extra logic here in the whole idea of separation of concerns. We actually defeat the purpose. Okay, so the interceptors itself should not look up what's next, right? The interceptors itself should have no idea of what's coming up next. So having said that, how do we solve this problem? Well, there could be several ways, but I will talk about how Struts 2 solves the problem at least. How Struts 2 interceptors actually solve this problem of achieving this flexibility without having dependency on the configuration. Okay, so this is supposed to be one of the complicated topics in Struts 2, so I hope you're paying attention. I'll try to be as clear as possible. So the way Struts 2 solves this problem of finding out which interceptor or which action to call next is by introducing a separate entity over here. Okay, so there is a separate entity called action invocation. So this is a separate object. This is kind of like the boss of the whole thing. Okay, this object is in charge of orchestrating everything. Okay, and this is the guy who's going to look at the struts XML. All right, so the interceptors do not look at the struts XML. Okay, they don't worry about where they are in the whole flow. They don't worry about who's coming up next. All they worry about is doing their job. So this part is not there. Finding out who comes up next is not there in any of the code. In fact, there are no two methods. Okay, there's just one method called invoke. Every interceptor has one method called invoke. This method is actually run when, as the name says, when the interceptor is invoked. But what does this method do? It has lines of code to execute as a pre-logic, right? So let's take the time interceptor. The time interceptor in its pre-part is actually making a note of the time. So all that line of code is over there. And then when it's done with the pre-part, right, it says there's a line of code here which says, it talks to this guy, the action invocation. It takes, hey boss man, I'm done with the pre-part of it. So you do what it takes to get the next guy in, right? You look at the struts XML, you look at whatever you want to look at, pass the control to the next guy, and so on. Okay, and when all of that is done, when all the subsequent interceptors and the action, everything is run, and then on the way back when everything else is run, then return back control to me so that there is lines of code below that which need to execute as a part of the post. Okay, I hope this is making sense. Let me clear this out and explain this. So let's say I have these three interceptors, I1, I2, and I3. Okay, all of these, so this is a class, right? All these are classes. I1 is a class, I2 interceptor is a class, and I3 is a class. So all of these interceptors have a common format. They have this method intercept. I think I made a mistake in I think I said invoke, it's actually intercept, forgive me. It's the method, the single method inside all the interceptors is called intercept. So the intercept method has pre-logic, right? And then it has the action invocation dot invoke, and then it has the post logic. So this is actually a call on the object itself. I'll talk about how it gets a handle to the action invocation object. So this is this guy over here, the action invocation object, right? This is the boss guy. Okay, so I'll talk about how these interceptors get a handle to the object itself, but it's actually calling a method of the action invocation object. So it's calling the invoke method of that object. So the same thing over here, you have an intercept method, and again it does its thing. So the pre and post logic of these interceptors actually depend on the interceptor itself. So if say I1 is a timer interceptor, so this logic contains code to make a note of the time before and after. Okay, so if I say I2 is a logging interceptor, this logic contains code to make a log of something before and after or something like that. So the logic itself depends on the interceptor, what it's trying to do, but all these interceptors will have a common line of code here, action invocation.invoke. And this has the post as well, and then close intercept. And same thing for I3, it has an intercept method in it, and then it does the pre, and then action invocation.invoke, and it does the post. Okay, so these are the three interceptors. Let's say we are trying to trace action A1, and A1 has been configured with these interceptors, I1, I2, I3. Okay, so let's look at the flow of what happens, right? So this guy, the action invocation, is the main guy. Okay, he's in charge of orchestrating the whole thing. So the action invocation invoke, so this invoke is run. The framework runs the invoke. Okay, so this is the main method of the action invocation. So the invoke, what it does is it takes a look at the struts XML. All right, so struts XML is its reference. This is looking at the struts XML all the time. Okay, so it takes a look at the struts XML. It knows that the request that's coming in is for the action A1, and it knows that the action A1 has these three interceptors configured, I1, I2, and I3. So what it does is it pulls up the first interceptor, which is A1, and calls the intercept method of that interceptor. So now the interceptor I1, the intercept method of I1 runs, and then it does the pre-work, and then once it's done with the pre-work, it says, hey, action invocation guy, I'm done with the pre. Now I'm calling the invoke. Okay, so you do what's coming up next. And once you're done with all the other stuff, come back so that I can do the post. Okay, so that's all that the I1 does. So it calls the action invocation.invoke. Now this invoke takes a look at the struts XML again and says, okay, I1 is done, now I2. So it's actually recursive. So the same method gets called every time. So it acts in recursion, but it knows which type of the recursion it is, right? So it knows what to do next. So it looks at I2. Okay, this is the next interceptor. It's going to call intercept of I2. Okay, so again, I2, it doesn't really care where it's coming from. It doesn't really care whether it's the first or the last or the middle. It just runs the pre, right? It runs this logic and it says, hey, action invocation guy, I'm done with my pre, so you take over. You do what's next. So it calls invoke again. Now the invoke again looks at where it is right now. Okay, it says I2 has run. I was going to take a look at I3. It's going to do it. It's the same story again. The pre runs and then I3 says, hey, I'm done with my pre, so you take over. Now the action invocation guy takes a look. It says, okay, there are no more interceptors. So it calls the action. Okay, so the action runs. And when the action returns, now it's going to return this one, right? So this invocation returns. Now the post of I3 runs. Okay, so this control is handed over back. So then the post runs. And now this returns, which means this returns, this method returns. And now this post executes and this returns, which means this method returns and this post executes and this returns. So this is pretty much how the stack of interceptors execute. So the post, so the pre, and then the pre, then the pre, then the action, and then the post, then the post, then the post. Okay, so this is how interceptors are, this is how the flow of interceptors go. Okay, and this is achieved using recursion. If it's too confusing for you now, just don't worry too much about it. At least I think you have got the overall picture of how these things work. So every interceptor has an intercept method, okay, and each intercept method does whatever it does, but then it has one line. It should have at least one line that says, hey, action invocation invoke, right? Or else the control does not go further. So the one final thing which you have to know is how it gets a handle to the action invocation, right? Every interceptor has a handle to the action invocation. How does it get it? It gets it because the intercept method itself takes in a parameter called action invocation. So it takes in one parameter. Every intercept method takes one parameter called the action invocation. So that's where the action invocation passes itself when it calls the intercept, right? So all these intercepts are actually being called by this guy, the boss guy. So when it calls the intercept, it actually passes a reference to itself so that it knows each interceptor has an object to call the invoke on. Okay, so whatever is passed to this interceptor, it just calls the invoke of that object. So that's how this whole chain of interceptors is achieved in Struts 2. I hope you have kind of at least the basic idea of how this is happening. You can probably rewatch this video if you still have some confusion of any of these concepts. In the next tutorial, I'm going to take a look at one of the interceptors, and actually we'll take a look at the code. We'll take a look at how this flow is achieved, and hopefully it'll be a much more clear picture then.